Hey, Mike, you're all set.
Hey, good morning. I would like to call the meeting of the Policy and Personnel Committee to order. It is 9 a.m. Stephanie, would you please take attendance?
Yes, thank you, Mike. Ava Bermudez Zimmerman,
Present.
Elma Kitterick, I think she's joined us yet. Alice Pritchard,
Present.
Mike Soltis,
Present.
and Holly Williams has not joined us yet, but we do have a quorum.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. I would like to welcome and thank the members of the public for joining us today. First item on the agenda is a review and approval of the April 2nd, 2024 meeting minutes. I would ask the committee for review and a motion to approve those minutes.
So moved.
Second,
Second.
all in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? Abstentions?
I don't know if I'm formally a member of the committee yet, but I would abstain because I wasn't here for the last meeting.
Okay,
Good morning, David. So, everybody, this is David Salazar. He's our
welcome,
newest member of
David.
the board and will be joining the committee. So I think we can have you continue to participate in the meeting. So we'll just note that for the attendance.
Okay, thank you. So the motion carries. Next item, Aaron, would you please lead the discussion regarding the contribution rate setting process?
Sure. So I can share my screen real quickly. Okay. You can see my screen okay?
We can see your screener.
Okay. I'm not sure why it looks like that. So I'm sharing slides that were presented at Finance and Audit.
So Aaron, really quick, right now all we can see is your file folder.
Well, that's not good. Let's try that again. Sharing.
Good morning. I apologize for my lateness.
Good
morning.
morning.
Morning, Ellen.
I'm trying to share my screen and it is not wanting me to. So let's try this one more time. Is that better?
Yes.
There we go.
Okay. So Finance and Audit, a couple of weeks ago, we have, and Holly's coming in. I'm gonna let her in. We continued the conversation about the contribution rate setting. Just as background, the statute requires the authority to collect contributions such that the paid leave trust balance is sufficient to ensure the ongoing ability of the fund to pay the income replacement benefits and to limit the need for contribution rate increases or benefit rate reductions due to changing economic conditions. So that is what the statute says. That is what governs the board right now. Beyond that, the board has sort of pretty clean and clear discretion to set the rate, understanding the cap at 0.5%. We have been talking for months now about what practically the board wants to consider when setting the rate. And part of what we're asking this committee to do is think about, should those practical considerations take the form of a policy? So just again, as a quick reminder, I can get this page to move. It's not going to, so I'm going to stop sharing. We have identified as certain factors, looking at future anticipated costs taking a 10-year view as opposed to a 1 or a 2-year view in terms of anticipated costs so that we can really get that landscape approach. Making sure that we include reserves to account for, and I keep stumbling over this because they're truly not unanticipated situations because we're anticipating them. They're situations that we don't expect to happen but could happen, such as if we have multiple years of lower than anticipated contributions or higher than anticipated calls for benefits. And so finance is kind of thinking about what does the math look like? We're asking this committee to think about what the policy, if anything, should look like. So we have some factors that we've identified. Last meeting, we started this conversation and the committee had asked us to look and see what other quasi-public agencies do with regard to rate setting. Are they explicit in terms of what they consider in their factors? Do they put in their formula? Kind of what do they do? What's the landscape? Michael did some research, which I'll summarize, but he can jump in if you have questions. And the short answer is, to the extent that quasis have explicit policies regarding rate setting, they're very vague, they're very general. They basically just assert the truism that these entities have the authority to set rates. So that's interesting to know. I think it sort of tells us that the precedent is to keep it at a high level, to keep it, if we need one at all, to keep it at a very high level, maybe just identifying factors to consider as a non-exclusive list, but it would not be the norm to have a policy that is very specific, that includes any sort of actual numbers or calculations. So I just wanted to share that as background for this conversation. Michael, do you want to add anything to what you found in your research?
I think you did a great job explaining it, but just as sort of an example, for like Access Health, the health insurance exchange, their policy will say something along the lines of regular assessment and fees will be determined based on the amount reasonably and prudently needed to operate the exchange as set forth in the annual budget reviewed and approved by the board. Such assessments and fees shall be charged no less frequently than annually. Final determination as to the terms, conditions, basis, amount, frequency, methodology, including any modifications thereto of any assessments or fees will be shall rest at the sole discretion of the board acting in accordance with the applicable law. That's sort of the type of language they use for their policy. Doesn't add a lot of clarity, does consider some things to consider, or maybe the process, happening annually, but nothing that I could find in any of the examples for quasis that sort of held them to any particular calculation or formula or standard.
Okay, so what is it that you want from this committee? Some input or questions?
Yes.
Or
Really just kind of input on where you think we should go. I think we've got 3 potential options. One is to do nothing. The statute gives the board discretion. The statute identifies at the highest level what should be considered in setting the rate. So we could just opt for that. And anything that we do in terms of setting factors and kind of coming up with those calculations could simply be the staff showing our work as we make recommendations to the board, and as the board ultimately makes its annual decision about the contribution rate. So one is sort of essentially status quo, with any of the factors that we develop simply being how, so that you, the board, know what is the basis for the recommendations we're making. Again, sort of showing our work. Option 2 is to draft a relatively high-level policy that is along the lines of the ones that other quasis have, that says the board has the discretion to establish these rates. In utilizing this discretion, the board may consider the following non-exclusive list of factors. Including timing of contributions, long-term impact, risk of lower contributions or higher expenses, sort of whatever. We can come up with a sort of high-level statement. Third would be to craft our own path, go out alone and say, we want to be really specific. We want the board to be kind of explicitly guided and in some ways constrained by specific formula, and really go that path. So those are, I think, are the three options, although we can identify if there's other options out there. I will tell you, I would not recommend that third option. I think, particularly since this is our first run at coming up with a formula, I think we should see how it goes before we, if ever, kind of put the numbers into a policy that needs public comment. But those are the things that we'd like you all to consider and give us feedback on.
Okay, any questions or comments?
I think Alice had her hand up first and then Ava.
Okay.
I too would, I think I would support the second option. I think it would be good for us to put in writing how often we would look at this and some of the factors that we would consider. I agree with you, Erin. I wouldn't want to go to I don't think the status quo is quite enough, and I certainly don't think that the restrictive language would be helpful, but I think it would be good for the public and for board members to know how often we will look at it and some of the factors that we would consider, like 5 and 10 year projections, those kinds of things I think would be really helpful. I'd be very supportive of that plan 2 or option B, whatever we're calling it.
Okay, we have Ava?
Ditto to what Alice said. I would also add that so far in the creation and implementation of this authority, we have used other quasi-publics as examples, and it has been prudent, mimicking some of the bylaws and some of the examples that other quasis have used have been beneficial. And I wouldn't, this I feel is no different.
Okay, thank you. Holly?
I think actually Ava shared my sentiments to the T, so I would just echo what Alice said. And I do think that, as all of the plans nationally mature and have a longer time horizon and cycle to reflect on, I think it's good for us to kind of harken back to learned experiences from them. But I think, and so along those lines, I think given the infancy of Connecticut's program, I would be resistant to be too prescriptive, because I think that we don't have a good faith basis to make those decisions. And I think that, it's very difficult once a policy is laid out to go and modify it in whole. So yeah, I agree with my other colleagues on the board.
Okay. Ava, is your hand up again, or was that from last time? All right.
Remnants, let me take it up.
So I have a question. Is another option to have an internal procedure as opposed to a policy?
Yes. So that really would be, I guess, 1A, right? So, and that's kind of where we are right now. We have the internal procedure would be, this is what we at the authority staff are doing in order to craft the recommendation that we bring to the board. We can explain the basis for our recommendation by pointing out these are the factors that we consider. But the board itself would have really just the statutory constraints without any other
Mhm.
provision. It's I envision that any policy that would be drafted would include kind of a catch-all language that would enable the board to consider other factors that they deem appropriate.
Mhm.
So I'm not sure that there's practically much of a difference between option one, sort of internal procedure that we bring to the board, and two, a policy that we kind of explicitly identify factors that we've identified, factors that we've considered. There may be some value if anyone were to ever challenge the process to show that, you know, we've done it in this public way.
Yeah, so you kind of hit on what my next question, what is the benefit of one versus the other? I guess if we go with the public policy, we have to publish it and we would get some comment,
Mhm.
which may or may not be valuable, right? Any other advantages? I see a disadvantage. It's easier for us to change an internal a procedure, right, as opposed to an adopted policy. Any other?
So I think you've hit on the two. I think if we were to be challenged, it's easier to defend a publicly adopted policy. It's sort of a gray area in terms of whether we are required to adopt an official policy with regard to this. Even our enabling statutes says it defines certain things that the board shall adopt policies for, and then another set of things that the board may adopt policies for. The contribution rate is a may, not a shall. So right now there is complete discretion on the board's part. Adopting a policy would in some ways limit that discretion, but it also provides some security for the board if anyone were ever to say, well, why did you do it this way? And defends against a charge of arbitrary and capricious rate setting, which really would be the way that someone would challenge us.
Okay. So it sounded like at least 3 board members that we heard from prefer the policy approach, right? And I mean, I think the next thing would be what, to look at a policy, because we really want a policy that doesn't diminish our discretion at all, right? That's the goal.
Right. I think the next approach would be for us to draft something for the committee's review, which we could bring to the committee in June and bring to the full board at the June board meeting. Given that the full board meeting in May is 2 days from now, I think the turnaround is too tight. So we were contemplating really doing this in June. So we can draft something, circulate it, so people have a chance to review it before the June board meeting, and then bring that back so that there's a chance to really look at what the words would say and how we'd want to frame it, so that if the concern, right, is if we identify a factor that's not in the policy, we want the policy to be elastic enough to account for it, but still precise enough to be somewhat meaningful. So that's something that we can draft up and circulate.
Okay. Everybody on board with that process? Sounds
Alice?
like it.
Yeah,
So
can I just offer that in addition to the factors, I
Sure.
think the other transparency we need is how often does it happen?
Yeah,
And so that, I think timing and factors are the two things generally we'd want the policy to speak to.
certainly. So we have to set, the board has to identify the contribution rate every November. But I think there's also a value in kind of setting out when we'd like these decisions to be made. Last fall, we talked about how October feels too late. So we can absolutely kind of encourage in the policy earlier contemplation of the rate setting than October.
Okay, I just have one last question. So we're gonna have this policy that's very broad. Yet we're working on, I'll call it a mathematical formula. And one of the concerns, or one of the advantages or one of the concerns I have is that I want to make sure for the continuity of the board as board members change, that formula continues. At least that's the default, right? So how do we accomplish both the broad policy and the very specific formula that we want to be the default?
So I think the way to accomplish that is for the broad policy to identify the elements or the factors, and then similar to the language that Michael found in other agencies, it still gives the board the discretion to actually set the rate, and then the math and the formula become kind of the way to comply with the policy, but also allow us to assess, is 0.3 the right number, or is it, 2.5 or whatever, whatever the math, could be. So I think there's a way to frame it so the policy identifies factors to consider in implementing the formula, and then implementation is done kind of based, again, we at the staff level would say, we took these factors, this is how we made our recommendation, and showing our work, or do you think this makes sense?
Okay, thank you. Anything more on that issue? No. Okay, thank you. Let's move to Erin, a discussion regarding COLA increases for the authority staff.
Thank you. So kind of contradictory in what I said before about we don't want to do too many things when there's only 2 days before the board meeting. But COLA feels like it's a relatively simpler matter than contribution rate setting. So I wanted to give you all a heads up that at the board meeting on Thursday, we have a couple of matters on the agenda. One is next year's budget. 2 would be asking the board for approval to authorize cost of living increases for authority staff in accordance with the COLA rates that were recently adopted or affirmed, or whatever the verb should be, by the legislature for classified state employees. So the 1/3 of authority staff who are unionized classified employees will be getting a COLA. Holly, I blanked on it. Is it 2.5%? Okay.
Correct.
Last year, when something similar happened, the board authorized a COLA rate of the same amount, the 2.5%, for the rest of the authority staff who are not unionized classified members. And so we're basically anticipating asking the board to vote on that on Thursday, but we wanted to make sure that that was okay with the Policy and Personnel Committee before bringing it to the full board. There's obviously a value in treating the entire staff as consistently as possible and not having sort of gaps between our unionized staff and our non-unionized staff. There's also a value from a recruitment and retention perspective of having our employees be treated the same as the rest of executive branch employees. We do have folks who have moved from executive branch agencies into the authority, and people can always move out if they feel that they're not being appropriately compensated. So we would like to keep the wonderful people that we have and continue to be a desirable place for people to come, particularly as we have some recruitments happening. And so I just wanted to kind of flag that for this committee in case there are any concerns before we bring it to the board on Thursday.
Ava,
I would suggest that we propose language automizing the COLA for the non-contracted employees, with the exception if there's a financial crisis.
I mean, so that we don't have to deal with this every year.
Every year. Yeah, exactly.
I think that's a good idea. I mean, my sense is, we agree with you, Aaron, we ought to keep everybody kind of in line. If everybody agrees with that, then we probably should just have an internal guideline or a process, procedure that when the unionized staff gets a COLA, the non-unionized staff gets a similar COLA, and we could add the exception for exigent circumstances. I think Holly has her hand up.
I don't know, Alice, you were before me.
Please, you
Oh.
go first, Holly. You go first.
I would just say that would rebuff practice for how we deal with non-unionized state employees in the executive branch and at the legislative branch. There's usually language or an E item that gets issued at the time so that there's a complementary action at the time the decision is made to deal with the two employees. I think there's pros and cons to automation. But I think that there may be prudent reasons not to do that in the future. As the board matures, you may want to deal with managerial employees separate and apart from some of your unionized staff or things like that. So I think that aside from the fact that it would be a departure from practice, I think that, I think it's prudent to kind of leave yourself some autonomy to deal with things as they come up on an annual basis.
So at the state, they make a decision every year whether or not the managerial employees would get the cost of living. Is that how it's done?
So
Yeah.
traditionally, yes. I mean, in short, yes. So when the contract's negotiated with the unions, there then needs to be a separate managerial decision. There needs to be a separate executive decision as to how to or not roll out those wage changes and other provisions that impact managerial staff. And the term managerial, I understand, is a broad term. So for those who don't spend their free time dabbling in the State Personnel Act, it encompasses a broad cross-section of employees. It may not be what private sector traditionally thinks of as the director of a division that directly oversees individuals, but that's the classified term for those employees. So that's a long answer to your question, but the answer to your question is yes.
Okay. Alice?
I was just actually going to ask Holly, do you know if the E item has been executed? I think we were.
So I can't comment. That's
Okay.
that's outside of the scope of what I could comment on now.
Okay.
But but I can say in the most recent past, it was extended to managerial employees. That being said, there have been years where that has not been the case.
So I just was wondering whether we were ahead of the states. So again, that would be my only question, Aaron, about doing it in May instead of waiting and doing it in June, is that we might be ahead of the state determination on that E item. And so don't know if you'd want to do the union employees now and the non-represented in June, once we had that clarity, that might,
Sure, that's
might
a
line
great
up.
point. So we don't have to do anything for the union employees because that's already covered. So, and I have to admit, I have lost my DAS Spidey sense, so I really hadn't double checked to see if the item had been issued yet. So if, which is why it's really good to talk to you guys. Happy to say that issue should be deferred until June. Happy to post an amended agenda where that item gets dropped from the agenda so that we can take it up in June, presumably. Our only goal was just candidly to get it kind of coordinated in time because there's processing happening on payroll side, but we can certainly do it in June if that makes more sense.
So I would just add that, and maybe this will dovetail with I think Ava's intent. I mean, you could have something along the lines of, you know, the authority shall adopt policy, or, you know, the authority shall extend, you know, wage increases and annual increments and, you know, financial considerations in accordance with or in conjunction with the approval of same policies done on the executive side or the legislative side. I mean, you could do that as opposed to just making it a blanket, that instead of tying it to the union contract, you tie it to the action of the other, the actions of the executive. Now, you're not bound to that, right? You're not bound to that. But you could do that way. You could do it that way too, if you wanted to signal something.
And if we did do that and the item happens 3 days from now, which it's, you know, then it could go into effect without us having to hold until June. So if the policy said we would do what the state does or better, but you know, that we would do what the state does, or the timing would align with the state, that might allow you to move forward, or maybe not. I might be talking myself out of that.
Typically, the COLAs don't go into effect until July anyway, so I wouldn't have a concern about doing it in June. I think prudence dictates that the board see what's in an item before they decide to adopt it. An item, just for folks who are wondering what the heck we're talking about, is colloquialism for the way the state adopts policies that are countersigned by OPM and DAS that apply to compensation for non-represented employees, and it goes back to authority under 5-200E. So that's why we keep talking about items.
Okay. Ava, I see your hand up.
I do have it. I just want to point out that the way that the state budget works is very different than the authority, in the sense that with the state of Connecticut, you have the general fund, and you have to be mindful every given year to allocate the appropriate funding for the necessary work that you have, be it social programs or collective bargaining raises. Whereas the authority has a very clear and defined revenue source, that is perpetual. So in theory, we shouldn't expect financial crises in mismanagement like the overall general fund or overall Connecticut budget that we've seen in the past, that resulted to fiscal constraints. I would also add that in the 10 years of me union organizing state employees, one of the number one reasons that managerial staff that could still bargain, that were not appointed, that I've organized in the past, which are in the hundreds, it was because the state of Connecticut foregoed COLA raises or raises in general for a multitude of years. So once again, reinforcing that we don't want to lose authority staff just because they are not getting a COLA that everyone else is getting. And I want to point out that my original idea was mimicking the COLAs that are already given, not giving COLAs to managers that haven't been approved to other workers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just one thing to add in. I will tell you, I don't think it's a surprise. The anticipated budget that the board will be voting on includes as as we always do, the possibility of raises, right? That doesn't mean that we guarantee raises, but we always budget for that possibility so that, because sometimes the CBAC deal doesn't get worked out as early as it did this year. So we could definitely move forward with the budget vote on Thursday without having a decision about the COLA. And we can certainly defer COLA to June without, I think, raising the issues that I share with Ava about, lack of competitive benefits for our staff.
Okay. Okay, so we're all set for Thursday, right? And then we'll deal with the COLA. One last question. Holly mentioned there's some benefit to maintaining our autonomy. And I just wondered what your thoughts or Michael's thoughts are on that, because quite honestly, reviewing COLA once a year is not that big of a deal. And is there a benefit to not just tagging along with the state to our autonomy?
Yes, as Eva says, sometimes our budget constraints are not the same as the general funds. There may be situations in the future where DAS and OPM make decisions which they have to make sort of on behalf of the thousands upon thousands of state employees that are not necessarily consistent with our concerns. And so I think up or down. So I do think that there's a reason why when OPM and DAS issue E items, they don't automatically apply to our non-represented staff. And I think there is a value in having that kind of check at the board level to say, do we want to do this or not? But I also recognize that going out ahead of executive branch action kind of changes what we would say, because we can't say we're doing this to be consistent with the executive branch if the executive branch hasn't done it yet. So I do think there's a value in kind of having that check, again, up or down, depending on our circumstances.
Okay, and we don't need to decide that today.
Correct.
Right. Okay, anything else on that topic? Seeing no hands, we'll move to the next topic, which is an update on the 2024 legislation. Aaron, your floor again.
Best news is that our bill passed both the House and the Senate. So our bill is Senate Bill 222. We made a variety of changes. Maddie has explained them to the board a few times now, but amongst the things it does is create a mechanism for us to enter into MOUs with the federally recognized tribes on behalf of the tribal enterprises. That would create a mechanism for their staff to join our program. It also cleans up and actually creates a definition of municipality for both the paid leave program and Connecticut FMLA, so that we have a very clear answer to when is somebody a municipality and not, which will have the result of actually increasing enrollment in our program, because there are a number of sort of entities that, based on the lack of statutory definition, kind of were arguably considered to be municipalities that won't be. And really now a municipality is a town or city or really any entity with the ability with taxing authority. So nice and easy for us to implement. It also does some cleanup around when benefits are considered to constitute a barrier to accepting our benefits. And for the team, I think our most favorite thing is that it changes our reporting obligation, so that instead of having a report due in July and another report due in September, we have one report that's due in September that will encompass everything. So we're very excited about that, because now we can report on full fiscal years and not try and scramble to get everything done in May. So we're thrilled that it made it through the Senate. and it made it through the House. It made it through both with bipartisan support, which was notable, because the original enacting language did not have bipartisan support. And it is awaiting governor's signature. So that's the biggest news. Other news, paid sick days, which is different from the paid leave program. Paid sick days make sure that all full-time workers have access to 40 hours of time if they need it for non-serious health conditions or for other specific reasons. And so that made it through the House last week, and after several hours of debate, was passed out of the Senate last night. So that was very exciting. And the third bill that we're watching very closely is actually a DOL bill, but it affects us because it establishes the standard of review that the Superior Court would follow if somebody files an appeal of a DOL appeal. So if we deny benefits, people can go to DOL for an appeal. DOL upholds our decision. They can appeal that decision to the Superior Court. There's no language in the statute that kind of defined what that process looked like. And Senate Bill 220 fills that gap. That was passed out of the Senate last week, I think, Ellen, and is sitting on the House calendar. So we're very hopeful that that will receive action before midnight tomorrow. It passed out of the Senate unanimously, passed out of committee unanimously. So we hope it'll make it onto a House consent calendar in the next 40 hours. Not sure how many hours are left. And then we'll have a full report of all the bills we're watching. We're watching a number of bills because there are outreach opportunities and partnership opportunities, but we'll do a full report when session ends.
Okay, thank you. Any questions, comments? Seeing none, we'll move on. Thank you, Aaron, for that. We'll look forward to the report. Any old business anyone wants to raise? Seeing none, any new business anyone wants to raise? In that case, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, the motion carries. The meeting is adjourned. It is 9:43 a.m. Thank you very much for your time this morning. Have a wonderful day.
Thank
Bye,
you, everyone.
everyone.
Thank
Everyone.
you.
Thank you.